you, Carol, and thank you, Carol and Pedro, for giving me the space. It's really exciting to be here and to tell you about some of the research that we've been doing with what social activity on social media can tell us about the trade in West African birds. Let's see if this works. So why are we looking at this particular trade? Well, before the 2007 EU ban on imports of wild source birds, West Africa was the largest importer of recorded legal live birds, with 3 countries accounting for 70% of that trade. However, that seemed to completely collapse after the 2007 ban, and it means that we currently know very little about the current species composition, the trade routes, and the impact on wild populations in West Africa. We have some particular concerns, which is the potential overexploitation of wild populations, which has already happened with the grey and tin-May parrots, which are endangered because of their involvement in the pet trade. The risk of infectious disease, as COVID has highlighted very darkly. Beak and feather disease has been found in tin-May parrots and rose-ring parakeets from exporter facilities in the region. And so there's the clear threat to captive and wild birds from exporter and importer countries and to humans, and beak and feather disease is only one example of potential diseases. And then, of course, you've got the introduction of invasive species, most worryingly, rose-ring parakeets, which are invasive species worldwide and can come from the region. We're most worried now because of the growth of trade activity on social media, as we've already had talks today, and the fact that it allows traders to easily access new international markets and to communicate directly with potential buyers and for buyers to be directed to them. There have been a bunch of recent studies which have surveyed trade activity on social media, and we wanted to use a similar method to see what insights we could get about the trade in West African birds broadly, specifically what species are being presented and advertised by traders and where they might be being sent to. For ethical reasons, I can't name the platform that we did the study on, but it was an international and popular platform. And ours was an intelligence-based survey using information that the World Parrot Trust had already collected from this research. And following a pilot study, we identified 9 pages used by traders active in West Africa, particularly Guinea, Senegal, Mali, and the Ivory Coast, all of which were most were personal pages, but all were pages where you had one creator producing content for a group of followers as opposed to a closed group. And we collected posts between June 2016 and 2020. And our 3 analysis goals were to identify the species that were being presented, to identify the trade routes that were in shipments which were shown in posts, and to also try and find out where people were coming from who were engaging with these posts. To give more information on what we collected, we gathered all posts which featured West African birds or related to their trade to try and account for the diverse range of ways that traders might be trying to promote different species and promote their activities, with the logic that species that were being represented would either be perceived as popular by traders or were widely available and were being caught in considerable numbers. So we collected advertisements, we collected posts featuring shipments, posts featuring just images broadly. We really put out a wide net, and we found 221 unique posts with unique set of images. In terms of the analysis, species identification was primarily from the images with a little bit of assistance from the text with the help of experts in West African birds. Trade routes, we got the location of the trade themselves from the basic profile information on their page, if that provided location. We looked at the text to see if it provided destination, and we also cross-referenced any cargo tracking codes which were visible on the shipping containers, which could give us the exporting countries, transit and importing countries, as well as the dates. In terms of engagement, we looked at all users who shared or commented on a post. And again, once again, we went to their profile and just looked at whether a location had been provided. And we also categorized comments specifically looking for trade-related comments, such as someone asking about how much birds were, saying that they wanted one, or whether they could export to a certain country. In terms of results, we found a wide diversity of different species and families. These were the top 15 most represented species that we found. And you can see that we have parrots, finches. We had quite a wide range of different doves and pigeons and turacos. And we found that the species that we found reflected quite nicely information from the 1980s and 90s before the ban on what species were popular then, suggesting that popular species haven't necessarily changed over time that much. There were some species that were frequently represented, but that we couldn't identify to a species level, often paradise widers or starling species, because the quality of the images wasn't good enough for us to be able to make those fine distinctions, which is a limitation. In terms of highlights, we found 10 CITES listed species, with 3 Appendix 1 listed species, grey parrots, Timney parrots and black crowned cranes. For all of these, there was at least one post following the date on which they were listed on Appendix 1, some of which explicitly advertised trade. And so some of the people we were following were promoting trade that, if it occurred, would be considered illegal. Interestingly, we also found 2 species where on the IUCN database, pet and display use is not listed as an official use or trade for these species, whereas it was for all the others. And more generally, we don't have, they're not known, we don't know them to be more generally involved in trade, at least from the World Parrot Trust, and so it might be interesting that they popped up. Our conservation concerns were primarily that the conditions that birds were being kept in were very worrying for disease. Multiple species were often kept in the same enclosures and in very high densities, with 62 unique posts showing birds being kept in the same facilities, and with a maximum of 8 species being kept in the same enclosure, and with several of the species having a record of potentially spreading disease, and so there's a risk of cross-species contamination, and it's just quite worrying. In terms of invasive species, a lot of the species we identified are associated with some record of an alien population, 17 of which have been linked to the bird trade, and so that is quite concerning. But as I said earlier about the rose-ring parakeet, this was the most frequently represented species that we saw. We saw a lot in enclosures, in containment, and also in shipments. So they are being traded, and this is, again, a concern. In terms of the shipments that we saw in posts, it was a small number that we were able to get the export and import information for, but they appeared to be going to the Middle East and to the Arabian Peninsula, particularly Kuwait and Oman, which reflects existing literature fairly well in terms of the area being important for demand in exotic species. What was interesting is that when we looked at the location of engaged users, we got a slightly different picture, or an additional pattern. The light green here represents the location of users who, of all engaged users for whom there was location in the profile, whilst dark green represents the location of those who made trade-related comments. And here you can see that there is a kind of hub of engagement and interest from the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, but that the biggest demand comes from India and Pakistan. And this is interesting because it shows that when you get different insights from different sources of data, it has shown a pattern that didn't appear with the other data. But also it's interesting because there have been very, very low levels of imported birds into India for many years now. It's been quite, at least tightly regulated. And while it's important to note that expressions of interest don't reflect actual trade occurring, And it may be possible that users from some regions are more likely to connect with traders through private communications, and this may well be happening on a more broad scale. It's interesting that there is this large area of demand, even just the comments, for a country that doesn't seem to be importing birds, and so this might reflect some illegal activity. With a more broad point about method, we found that a lot of the posts on these personal pages didn't explicitly advertise text, didn't explicitly advertise trade in the text. This is a upset plot which represents the frequency of posts which had an overlap of different indicative information. So, for example, had an imagery and profile information that indicated that trade was occurring. And we found that there were these other indicators that trade was happening even when you didn't have the text. So, for example, in the imagery, you'd have date sheets suggesting that there was it was stock being sold. In the profile description, some pages would say explicitly that they were exporters and importers. And in the comments, you had the interactions between the trader and potential buyers, where it was clear the trader had an intention to trade the animals, or at least trade animals more generally. And our concern is that a lot of these posts wouldn't be coming up using a text-based search. And that you need to it's important to triangulate these different sources of information to make these more nuanced judgments about posts which are relevant and may contain useful insights. Otherwise, they may remain hidden. To conclude, overall, we were able, looking at social media, we were able to identify a diverse range of species that we think may be present in the trade from West Africa. And we hope that the findings can prompt future research into the volume and impact of this trade on wild populations, and also in terms of disease prevalence in the area and the risk that this poses. We're able to highlight some trade routes and point out that different methods of gaining and different patterns. And more generally, we want to re-emphasize the importance of triangulating multiple sources of information to identify posts that facilitate and promote and advertise trade, particularly on personal pages, in order to prevent those being lost, and that this might be a limitation to automated monitoring systems that solely use a text-based search to identify relevant posts. I want to particularly thank the other people who worked on this research with me, Rowan Martin, Anna Nuno, and Amy Hinsley, and to also thank Nick Borrow and Benedictus Freeman for being amazing, helping with the bird identification, and most of all, to thank Caroline and Pedro for giving me the space to present this today.